So my presentation is on the floods in Ethiopia in 2006. And here I provided a map of Ethiopia so you could see all the different regions. So the floods aren't common really in Ethiopia, but they do have a rainy season annually from June to September. This particular year, Ethiopia experienced the heaviest and most intense rains on record. And some reports differ, but the earliest floods that were reported began on August 5th and continued throughout the entire month. Um, Important dates to note are August 5th through the 7th. So the first flood that occurred was a flash flood, and it occurred at night, which took many people by surprise, which contributed to the tragedy of how many lives were lost. And these rains didn't just stop in August, it lasted through September as well. So, what caused these heavy rainfall, or what caused these floods, was heavy rainfall, an overflowing dam, and deforestation. We'll get more into the deforestation that occurred and the human impact of that. So, here I provided an image that shows the Omo River, but at the beginning of the floods and then at the end, you can see how submerged in water this area is, and it's important to note that people live on these marshes because a lot of the sources of income were from fishing. So the magnitude of the flooding. So what caused this to be so tragic and catastrophic was how close the rainfall and flooding was. So people didn't have time to flee when it first occurred, and then they also didn't have time to recover. And each flood killed hundreds of people. Many hundreds were missing as well, and it displaced tens of thousands of people. The most affected regions were southwestern southern Omo River Valley and Dere Dawa, which both of these places recorded over 300 deaths. Some of these regions were submerged in 4 meters of water, which is around 13 feet, which is insane to even think about. And then the biggest causes of this are climate change and human action. So a lot of the source of income came from chopping down trees and selling the wood, and also selling stones. So Ethiopia's landscape is very hilly, and because that they would cut down all these trees and take the stones out of the hillside, it caused catastrophic flooding, mudslides, landslides. People were buried and covered in mud and sand. So here is another image that shows in more detail how many people were killed, how many people were affected, and how many were displaced. So here you could see more than 37,000 people were affected. Here around 15,000 people, over 300 died. And another thing is that they relied heavily on farming. So a lot of the cattle, the sheep, the goats, and chickens passed away. So these people lost their livelihoods, their sources of incomes, and ways to sustain their families. And also you can see where the flooding zones are primarily. So in total, thousands of people died and tens of thousands were displaced. And a quote that really stood out to me was how people who lived along the river were swept away almost instantly when the dam burst and the riverbanks flooded. I think that was just so sad to think that like these people didn't have a fighting chance because they didn't even know what was happening. And the majority of the deaths were children, unfortunately. And then also a lot of businesses were destroyed, which you'll see in the next pictures. You'll see buildings underwater. And the recovery effort was incredibly grueling. And they had to dig up hundreds of people who were buried in mud, buried in sand, and buried under other debris. So here you can see buildings underwater, people standing on top of roofs. Um, it's just awful, and people just had no longer had homes. Here you can see more cars and buildings underwater. This is a road that was swept away. So how did they combat this? So the dams did overflow, and many were unprepared for these heavy rains. But through several aid groups, the people initially thought that this was a result of the wrath of God, but then they later learned and were educated that this was a result of deforestation and, of course, climate change, which you can't really combat, but or at least they couldn't. But what they could control was the deforestation. So they learned how to properly cultivate the land, learned safe and sustainable ways to grow their crops and replant trees. They were taught risk assessment and action plans. So they were also able to rebuild the hillside within 2 years by building terraces that helped decrease the risk of flooding. So, with the money allocated, they were able to build stone terraces and they were able to plant seedlings and transfer them to the hill. Within 2 years, they managed to rehabilitate the area, and the terraces kept the water from running down the hills, which prevented erosion and allowed the water to percolate. This helped the people become more resilient to the floods. Many areas were able to be restored with monetary aid that was received, farms were rebuilt, and people were able to find a way to make money again and sustain themselves. Another risk reduction measure was the creation of a community based flood early warning system. This system consisted of mobile communication with upstream communities on information about rainfall or floods occurring upstream. Also, measures were taken to reduce the runoff water from the hills, and this water was diverted to farms. Through this, vulnerability to floods was reduced. This was proved to be successful because no lives were lost in the 2010 flood that occurred in the same region. So overall, this was a very terrible time for Ethiopia, but the people were very resilient and they were able to rebuild and take what they learned to ensure that no more lives were lost from flooding. Thank you. And oh, here are more images. This is a dam in Ethiopia that overflowed, and then you can also see more of the land that's underwater. And then these are my sources. None of these images belong to me. I got them all off of Google.